Okay, so Louisville is going to play tonight against Houston. Houston, of course, preseason top 15 team. They beat Oklahoma. Since, of course, they've fallen out of the rankings, they weren't ranked in the college football playoff. And this is a weird place for Louisville because if they beat Houston, Houston will never be a top 25 team. They lose to Houston, Houston will be a top 25 team. Maybe it helps Oklahoma. But in your mind, does Louisville have to blow out Houston in order to solidify their case to be in the Final Four, in those Final Four spots of the college football ranking?
I think they do, Doug. I think when it comes down to it, Louisville just doesn't really have an impressive array of wins. And I think that comes down to some of the games they won early. Now, you got the Florida State game, but then the lackluster performance, as some would call it, against Duke. They started off last week against Wake Forest and didn't really play well in the first half. Lamar Jackson didn't have his best game. And I think the bigger point to what you were saying about Houston having already beaten Oklahoma, they need to beat Houston because they weren't able to do it last year. The game came down, and obviously that was a baby Lamar Jackson then going against a Greg Ward who was established a little bit more. But when it came down to it at the end of the game a year ago, Greg Ward was able to lead his team down the field and beat Louisville. So they need to win the game because I think in the back of their minds they know this Houston team can beat them.
What do you make of, Lamar Jackson? Man, look, to those of us, the football fans, the football laymen, we're blown away by his speed, by his arm strength, by his overall talent. But in terms of, again, I know you're a college football analyst, but you're also an NFL draft expert as well. Give me your sense of where he is in the development as a pro type of quarterback.
I think the most interesting part about what you just said is that how he's developed, in terms of where we were just talking about a year ago and him moving on to the next level. I went and watched his last game of last season when he went for over 220 on the ground and threw for over 220 in their bowl game against a decent Texas A&M team. But to just see how far he's come along in terms of the little things, like, where his position is at on crossing routes and some of the makeable throws that he would miss a year ago, I think it's been unbelievable, that part of his development. Now, I do still think he needs to add some weight, but when you take into consideration just a couple years ago, Teddy Bridgewater was considered the best quarterback in the history of this program. And I think already Lamar Jackson has exceeded what he was able to do in school, kind of a similar build, but a lot more dynamic of an athlete. I think that's pretty amazing.
Wake Forest believes that they had a breach in security, that Louisville had some inside info. How much do you think this goes on where there's some type of spying going on between schools preparing for football games?
It's interesting to see how they say, because they found that they actually taped it onto the back. Maybe they left something and they were able to tape it on the back and somebody saw it. I don't know if that goes on a lot. I think that you may have still a little bit more than what people would suspect. It's interesting, though, because of just how, I think, stingy Wake Forest's defense is, that something like that would occur, and how the game started out and how they were able to make adjustments. It makes you wonder a little bit.
Corey Chavous joining us on the Doug Gottlieb Show, CBS and CBS Sports Network college football analyst, plus an NFL draft analyst for CBS Sports. All right, help me out with the rankings. If you had a top four, do you go four best teams? Do you care about conference championships? Because you're a pro and now viewing as a college analyst, what's your perspective on how we should rank the four best teams in college football as of now?
Well, I don't think that you should go with the conference championships, because if Louisville, again, you mentioned that they're able to have a really good performance tonight, and then the only game that they've lost, even though they've had some uninspiring performances, but if the measurements stack up in terms of the eye test, and you believe that they're the team that could give, as the 4 seed, for example, Alabama the best game, then I think you set the matchups up for what you believe in terms of who has the best player, what teams have the best ability to affect. I think you have to make it where the matchups are the best in terms of having a competitive Final Four. I think that's the advantage you have of being able to pick the playoff, because if you override that, then all of a sudden Oklahoma, they can go out this weekend and and beat West Virginia, then they come back and then they're able to beat Oklahoma State, you're going to have a hard time justifying why Oklahoma, even though they lost to Houston, but if, as you said earlier, Houston beats Louisville tonight, you're going to have a hard time saying Oklahoma's not deserving, and then they're a two-loss team, and then you have the two-loss versus one-loss. So I think you open up a lot more questions if you don't go by the team that you think matches up the best, which means inevitably you're looking at the rosters and seeing which teams actually have the best football teams to match up as those Final Four teams.
Okay, but help me out with this, though, okay? So there's a bunch of different places that you can go. Let's start with you mentioned Oklahoma. What do you do with, for example, Penn State or Wisconsin? Both would be two-loss teams, and if Ohio State beats Michigan, Penn State, and they'd beat Michigan State, and they'd have to beat Rutgers. Penn State would go to the Big Ten championship game. So do you leave, in your opinion, forget about the committee and what they may do, if it's up to you, Corey Chavous, CBS college football analyst, do you leave Penn State or Wisconsin out, put Ohio State in, even though Ohio State lost to a Penn State in a head-to-head?
I think you have to. I think you've got to be able to look at it and say, Penn State, you lost it earlier in the season to Pittsburgh. I mean, in the game, you very easily could have won. You had a chance to go down and win that game. I think you have to penalize them for that loss. And I think the fact that you were on the road and you are Ohio State, if you can go and beat Michigan, I think a team that's been arguably one of the best teams from a dominant standpoint throughout the season. I mean, I know that they don't have the Big Ten championship again, and then have to go through another game. But I think when you look at how they've dominated some of the opponents that they've had, I don't know if that one blip on their resume should just knock them out of it.
All right, here's the hard one, okay? Let's say USC, Colorado's got a couple tough games here upcoming. Let's say USC goes to the Pac-12 championship game and they beat Washington a second time. Okay, they would have 3 losses, but they're clearly a different team since Sam Darnold's been their quarterback. How do you feel about USC in comparison to some of these other teams?
I tell you what, you bring up a great point. I think USC, they're different. I actually went to go see them play the first game of the year against Alabama. I mean, they're a totally different football team with Darnold as opposed to with Brown at the helm. And so you've got to be able to take that into consideration. Now, I don't think you can take it into consideration where a 3-loss team goes in. Maybe I think that's maybe going a little bit too far, but then that goes back to what we talked about a second ago.
Conference champions.
Exactly. So now I think that part of it becomes a little bit dicey for me because at the time, I think the biggest thing the committee has to figure out is, are we going to take the team that's playing the best now?
Yep.
I think that's the other thing because now if you're going to say that, and Penn State wins the Big Ten championship, USC wins the Big. Are you now Pac-12? Are you now saying we're going to take the four best teams now, and maybe you've got a 3 and a 2-loss fan, and you've got a bunch of 1-loss teams like in Ohio State on the outside looking in?